Michelle Paet was an attractive mother of 4 living in the suburbs.
Michelle was absolutely stunning, beautiful young lady.
She was always everybody's center of attention.
She and her husband Nathan had been together nearly 12 years, traveling the country for his military career.
She loved him, with all her heart.
Everyone would say that they thought Michelle and Nathan had a perfect marriage.
But their perfect suburban life ended in a deadly ambush.
As soon as his garage door opened, these shots are fired.
An Air Force sergeant gunned down in front of his house. Made big news for Las Vegas.
The investigation would reveal that this seemingly average family was mixed up with some scary characters.
She happens to be a former porn star.
He is a multiple-time felon. He was a hardened criminal.
They were going to commit an armed robbery of a heroin dealer.
And that left the investigators wondering, had Michelle simply been caught in the middle?
She didn't know this was going to happen.
Or was she really behind it all?
This girl knew exactly what she was doing. She ended that text message with an LOL.
Like any night, the Las Vegas Strip was packed with tourists, partiers, and gamblers on the evening of December 1st, 2010. But for most of this sprawling metropolis of more than 1 million, it was a quiet Wednesday night, the same as in any American suburb.
When people hear about living in Las Vegas, just think, oh, you live in a high-rise hotel, casino? Well, that's not really the case. Las Vegas is no different than any city. We have neighborhoods, parks, schools.
And one of those neighborhoods was the peaceful planned community of Mountain's Edge at Sterling Ridge.
It was very far removed from the Las Vegas Strip,
which made what was about to happen even more frightening. At around 11:30 that night, a homeowner in this safe suburban community made a frantic call to Clark County 911.
She was nothing short of hysterical. She was hyperventilating.
The caller, 29-year-old Michelle Paet, told the 911 operator that a few minutes earlier, her husband had gone into the garage preparing to leave for a late-night duty shift at nearby Nellis Air Force Base.
She said she heard the garage door open, and she said all she heard was shots.
Terrified, Michelle hurried toward the garage, but just as she reached the door, it opened, and Michelle screamed in horror.
Her husband stumbled into the house, covered in blood.
He just collapses right by the stairs.
Her 911 call is absolutely chilling. You can hear her 4 children crying in the background.
The Las Vegas Metro Police were on the scene within minutes. Inside the house, they found 28-year-old Nathan Paet collapsed on the floor in a pool of blood.
He was shot multiple times.
He was bleeding to death.
An ambulance rushed the father of 4 to a local hospital.
He was still alive when they transported him.
But even as doctors rushed to save Nathan, the investigators were left with a mystery. Why had the father of 4 been shot in his own garage? Was he the victim of a random crime? Or would the investigation reveal that there were disturbing secrets lurking within what appeared to be an average all-American home? Born in 1981, Michelle Chaco's story began a world away from the Nevada desert in the middle of the vast Pacific.
Michelle was born on the island of Guam, which is a very small island.
It's a U.S. territory, so, we are U.S. citizens.
There is an American military base there. There are a lot of American service people, but otherwise they're all islanders.
It was a happy childhood growing up in a tropical paradise, surrounded by a large and supportive family.
She was always everybody's center of attention because she always had a big, bright smile.
Although when she was 15, tragedy struck. Michelle's mother became so seriously ill that she was flown to the mainland for treatment.
They had to take her over to California and she never saw her again. Unfortunately, she died at a young age.
When we lost our mother, it was hard. I assumed the role to take care of my brother and my sisters, and Michelle was always like my right hand.
Although Michelle also managed to make time for a busy social life.
She was always like Miss Popularity.
And she was especially popular with the boys.
Michelle was absolutely stunning, beautiful young lady. If you think of an island girl, a beautiful island girl, she fits the profile.
And one of the first boys to notice the blossoming island beauty was a classmate named Nathan Paet. Nate to his friends, Nathan was just a few months younger than Michelle and also a Guam native.
Everybody loved Nate. He was dear to everybody. Just typical island guy.
Boogie boarding was his thing. So like, let's say after he was done with work, he would want to go out to the beach, catch a couple waves.
Although after he met Michelle in high school, she immediately became his main interest.
He was absolutely floored by how beautiful she was, and he was just head over heels in love with her.
Michelle found plenty to like about Nate, too.
He was outgoing. He always wanted to do a lot of things. He was a great person.
Soon, the two teenagers started dating.
They were everyone's ideal couple.
And Nate hoped that would be true after graduation, too. He proposed, and Michelle said yes.
She loved him, with all her heart.
But the young couple would have to save up for a wedding. Nate got a job at a hotel on the island, and Michelle gave birth to their first child, a son.
They ended up moving in with his mother. And he was just working at the hotel, minimum wage, not enough money, and they're starting their family.
So in 2002, when he was 20, Nate joined the Air Force.
He wanted to better his career, provide for his family.
Although upon enlisting, the service took the young family far from their island home.
She kind of followed Nathan from Guam to Anchorage, Alaska, where they lived for about 4 years.
It was a transition. Everything was just new to them.
In 2006, after the birth of their second child, Michelle and Nate finally married. And after a short time in Tucson, Arizona, the Air Force promoted Nate in 2007 and assigned him to Nellis Air Force Base near Las Vegas.
He was a staff sergeant, and he was assigned to be a logistics officer for an F-15 squadron.
This guy was responsible for parts that small but costing millions of dollars, and he was very good at it.
Even as he excelled at his military career, family came first for both Nate and Michelle.
That's the way we were raised. Your kids first, then your spouse, and then take care of yourself.
And by 2009, they'd had 2 more, in addition to the son born in Guam and the daughter born in Alaska.
And they had 4 children in a very short amount of time.
Supporting a family of 6 on a military paycheck was tough, but Nate managed to save a little money.
At times, he would have to take a second job because he always wanted to provide for Michelle and his family as best as he could.
And in August of 2009, he'd saved up enough to surprise Michelle with a brand new home in Mountain's Edge.
He chose this house on his own and did everything. My sister had no idea.
And after years of living on military bases, she was thrilled with Nate's surprise.
It was a beautiful single-family residence, a 2-story home with approximately 2,400 square feet.
It was perfect for the young family, even if Nate wouldn't always be there to enjoy it. Soon after moving in, he volunteered for an overseas assignment.
He wanted to, make his enlistment be something, for his family and his kids to be proud of.
And in June of 2009, he shipped out for Iraq.
My sister, at one point, she was like, what if something happens? She was crying.
And worrying about her husband's safety wasn't the only challenge 27-year-old Michelle faced while he was deployed.
Her children were all young, so she was tasked with raising the children and providing for them and keeping the home and everything.
However, just like her family's struggle after her mother's untimely death, Michelle managed, thanks to the extra combat pay Nate was sending home, plus the income from her new part-time job.
Michelle Paet was working at the time at EIN, which was a telemarketing company here in Las Vegas.
And within 6 months, Nate was home.
He came, I think, before Christmas, before his daughter's birthday.
Once reunited with his family, Nate settled back into life as a suburban dad, while Michelle kept her part-time job and started making plans for a new career.
Michelle was actually attending a beautician school while also working a job for a telemarketing service.
And by 2010, the couple had been together for 12 years and appeared to be as in love as ever.
Michelle and Nate had a good family and a good marriage, good communication.
They were happy together. They would always compliment each other anywhere. Oh, my wife is such a beautiful lady, and she's just so caring with my kids. And she would return the favor. Oh, I have the best husband in the world. They're a perfect match for each other.
But on the first day of December, less than a year after Nate came home from Iraq, the couple's happy life would come to a sudden and violent end. Coming up, the investigators struggled to make sense of the shooting.
Air Force members who lead normal lives don't just randomly get shot.
Everyone would say that they thought Michelle and Nathan had a perfect marriage.
But was there a dangerous secret in Michelle and Nathan's fairy tale marriage?
The police started asking if she had any affairs or any love interests.
At 11:30 on the night of December 1st, 2010, Michelle Paet called 911 and reported that her husband had just been shot in their suburban home outside Las Vegas, Nevada.
She said she heard the garage door open, and she said all she heard was shots.
Las Vegas Metro Police were on the scene within minutes, only to find Michelle clinging to her stricken husband.
Michelle is absolutely hysterical, crying, screaming, and apparently administering some sort of help to her husband.
EMTs rushed 28-year-old Nathan Paet to the nearest hospital.
He was still alive when they transferred him, but he didn't make it.
Nathan was shot multiple times. One of those gunshot wounds ended up severing his carotid artery. There was no way to save Nathan at that point.
But why would anyone want to murder the father of four, an active duty airman at Nellis Air Force Base?
Air Force members who lead normal lives, who live in a normal neighborhood, raising a family, don't just randomly get shot.
At the scene, Michelle told the police it had been an ordinary night. At a little after 11 o'clock, she had been getting ready for bed while her husband got dressed.
His normal hours were set to start around 11:30 at night, and then he would work the graveyard hours all the way till about 7:30 in the morning.
Although according to Michelle, Nate had been running late that evening.
He kind of overslept, so he was rushing.
So far behind, in fact, that while getting dressed, he'd called a coworker to cover for him.
Everybody always had their back. They always looked out for each other. That was his camaraderie at work.
And then, according to Michelle, Nate had hurried out to the garage.
Nathan Paet had a very distinct pattern that he would go through when he would leave at night. He would open the garage door, and then he would go and he would sit down on a workout bench and put his shoes on.
Michelle said that was when she'd heard the shots.
She says she heard like two, and then she runs down.
And when she got to the garage door,
She's shocked and surprised by her husband coming into the house and collapsing, covered in blood.
He had enough strength to make it into the house, but he collapsed at the entrance into the living room.
the evidence at the scene appeared to confirm Michelle's account of the tragedy.
He left a pool of blood right underneath that workout bench.
But that still didn't solve the biggest mystery surrounding Nate's death. Why?
It's not normal for a decent, honest, law-abiding citizen to just get gunned down in his garage as he's going to work. It just doesn't happen.
And it especially didn't happen in suburban Mountain's Edge, miles from Sin City's infamous strip.
It wasn't an area where you would have a high amount of traffic, where there would be transients, where this would be maybe a random attack or a random robbery gone wrong.
Which led the investigators to conclude that the killer had targeted Nate specifically.
He was clearly ambushed. As soon as his garage door opened, these shots are fired.
However, the fact that the Paet's garage door had apparently been open did raise the possibility that one of the family's neighbors had witnessed the shooting. So, hoping for a lucky break, the investigators fanned out and started knocking on doors.
No one had seen what actually occurred inside the garage of the Paet home.
Two neighbors had seen something else, though. They told the police that when the murder occurred, they had been out searching the cul-de-sacs for their lost dog.
These two neighbors, as they were looking for the dog, suddenly hear gunshots. And then they saw a figure racing to a black Cadillac CTS that had been parked.
Was it the shooter? The neighbors couldn't say for sure. But whoever it was, he certainly acted suspiciously once behind the wheel of the car.
The lights suddenly came on and the engine revved up really fast, and then the lights were turned off, and this Cadillac CTS raced out of the neighborhood at an extreme high rate of speed.
As soon as the investigators learned of the suspicious vehicle, they relayed that information to Michelle.
Well, the police then asked Michelle, do you know anybody who drives a black car, a black sedan? And she says, oh, yes, my friend Michael Rodriguez.
But why would one of Michelle's friends be leaving the scene of her husband's murder? Was it a coincidence? Or was it possible that Michelle and Michael were more than friends?
So the police started asking if she had any affairs or any love interests.
She said she wasn't having an affair with anyone.
But then a horrifying thought occurred to Michelle.
She then gives the detectives a little bit more and says, I did flirt with some people at the office.
Michelle worked part-time at a local telemarketing firm.
And then she tells them Michael is one of the people that she flirts with.
Michael Rodriguez was a smooth-talking individual who had the gift of a silver tongue.
And the customers weren't the only people he charmed.
He was the guy at EIN that all the ladies liked. He was known as a player.
And Michelle admitted that the smooth-talking salesman had made a play for her, too.
Michael would say, like, Michelle, your hair looks great today. Michelle, did you get a haircut? Michelle, I'm going to get coffee. Would you like some coffee? Can I get you breakfast? Have you eaten today? Would you like some lunch? He paid attention to her.
According to Michelle, she'd played along up to a point, letting Michael take her to lunch or buy her coffee to boost her spirits while Nate was deployed to Iraq.
She has a guy who's flirting with her that was fun for her.
But she said she'd forgotten all about it once her husband came home.
Everyone would say that they thought Michelle and Nathan had a perfect marriage.
But what about Michael? Was it possible he'd read more into Michelle's flirting than she intended? And perhaps he didn't find it as easy to let go.
The police were immediately interested in wanting to talk to Michael Rodriguez.
And once they ran Michael's name through their databases, they wanted to talk to him even more.
He's a two-strike felon.
He's been in trouble with the law since teenage years.
He'd done time in prison as an adult, too.
He wasn't a Boy Scout, and his criminal history reflected the same.
And by the morning after the murder, the investigators had identified Michael as a person of interest and started watching his house.
They spotted Michael Rodriguez driving a black Cadillac CTS from his home to work.
The investigators pulled Michael over, and while they brought him in for questioning, they examined his car, too.
The police took it to the crime lab in order to be processed.
Once back at the station, the investigators asked Michael to account for his whereabouts on December 1st, and the fast-talking salesman had a ready alibi. He told the homicide detectives that he'd gone shopping after work that evening and bumped into a woman he just happened to recognize.
She happens to be a former porn star.
And with "Don't I know you from somewhere" as a way in, the smooth talker said he'd begun chatting up the attractive blonde.
Anybody that knew him to be charming.
He knew how to manipulate people.
And that night, according to Michael, he'd manipulated the former adult actress into an impromptu date.
They ended up driving over to the airport. They watched the planes land for a while, drinking some alcoholic beverages.
Then, after the airport, Michael said that they had adjourned to a nearby hotel.
He told the police that he took that porn star to the Sunset Station at 10:30 at night, checked into the room, and proceeded to have sex with this porn star that he had just met a couple hours earlier.
It was an incredible story, even for Las Vegas. But Michael said he had proof on his phone.
He made a video of himself having sexual encounter with this young lady, and he showed that to the detectives.
Michael also had the woman's phone number, which he shared with the investigators.
They proceeded to call her. She confirmed that he was with her on that particular night and nowhere around Nathan Paet's home on December the 1st at around 11:30
The investigators' most promising lead had suddenly evaporated. But did that mean their search for the Air Force sergeant's killer had gone bust? Coming up, someone makes a drastic change to their story.
She's in over her head.
And the investigators hit the jackpot.
She just starts spilling the beans.
By December 7th, it had been almost a week since Michelle Paet's husband, Nathan, was ambushed and murdered in the couple's suburban Las Vegas home.
Nathan was rushing to get ready for work. Say bye to the kids, bye to my sister, opens his garage, and then he gets shot.
Within hours of the shooting, the Las Vegas Metro Police thought they had identified a suspect, an ex-con and co-worker of Michelle's named Michael Rodriguez.
Michael drives a black Cadillac. There were a number of neighbors in that area who did see a black Cadillac speed out of the neighborhood.
However, a search of Michael's car hadn't produced any evidence, and Michael also had an alibi.
He told the police that he checked into the room and proceeded to have sex with this porn star that he had just met a couple of hours earlier.
And to the detective's surprise, it turned out to be true.
She was contacted by law enforcement. She was with Michael during all of those hours and all of the important hours on December 1st of 2010.
As a result, the investigation was at a dead end, even as it continued to dominate the local headlines.
An Air Force sergeant getting killed, gunned down in front of his house as he's getting ready to go to work is made big news for Las Vegas.
And it was about to get even bigger. On the morning of December 7th, after Nate's murder had received days of news coverage, the woman at the center of Michael's alibi unexpectedly got back in touch with the investigators.
She definitely heard the news, and so she started putting two and two together.
And what she told the investigators was guaranteed to make headlines, too. The actress said she knew Michael through her friend Jessica Austin, who happened to date a friend of Michael's named Corey Hawkins.
Michael Rodriguez met Corey Hawkins while both were serving prison sentences.
And according to the actress, Jessica had called her a few days before Nathan's murder to ask a favor.
Jessica reached out to ask her if she would be an alibi for Michael Rodriguez.
Because Michael Rodriguez and Corey Hawkins were going to commit an armed robbery of a heroin dealer.
And since the actress thought the supposed victim was a heroin dealer, she hadn't hesitated.
And she agreed that she would be the alibi for this drug deal gone wrong.
Her share of the proceeds for helping out would be $5,000.
So according to what the woman told the investigators, rather than spend the evening at the airport with Michael watching planes land, they'd actually gone over to Jessica and Corey's apartment on the evening of December 1st.
She was at Corey and Jessica's apartment on December 1st in the Green Valley area here in Las Vegas.
The actress said that once they arrived, Michael and Corey left to allegedly rob the drug dealer, while she and Jessica sat around the apartment, waiting.
She then proceeds to tell the police that at some point around 11:30 or so, Jessica Austin got a call from Corey.
And based on what Jessica did next, he had called with a very specific request.
Jessica immediately started a fire in the house, in their fireplace.
And a few minutes later, Michael and Corey had rushed in after completing their so-called robbery.
They immediately stripped off their clothes, that they put those clothes in the fire.
Then, once Michael had gotten dressed, his alibi said they had climbed into his car and rushed to the hotel, with Michael talking the entire drive.
She described Michael Rodriguez pounding in her head the alibi that they had just met at Walmart, that they hit it off, and that they had sex.
Michael's made-up story was what the actress had originally told the police. But she now knew that Michael and Corey's claim about robbing a drug dealer was a lie.
She had no clue what, obviously, Michael, Corey, and Jessica were planning to do to Nathan Paet. And she starts to realize that she's in over her head.
She gives a full statement and explains exactly what had happened.
Michael Rodriguez no longer had an alibi, and the investigators were confident that they had their killer.
He is a multiple-time felon. He was a hardened criminal.
But what could Michael Rodriguez have hoped to gain from killing Nathan Paet? Hoping for some information, the investigators asked Michelle to come in for another interview. And on December 7th, just hours before Nathan's memorial service at Nellis Air Force Base, his cousin drove Michelle down to the station for the interview.
On the drive, she's reminiscing about her relationship, her love for Nathan, the good times that she's had.
But then, leaving Nate's cousin waiting in the parking lot, Michelle went inside the station and told the investigators a rather different story. According to Michelle, her marriage to Nate was nowhere near as perfect as everyone assumed.
He never cheated on Michelle. He didn't abuse her. But he also didn't pay attention to her. He didn't say, Michelle, you look great today.
The things that she complained about were the everyday stressors of any married woman with 4 small children. Money, lack of affection.
And Michelle told the police that, feeling neglected, she had turned to Michael.
She tells detectives that, yes, she was involved with Michael Rodriguez and that the two of them had struck up a sexual relationship.
She just starts spilling the beans.
Although Michelle said calling what happened with Michael an affair was a stretch.
There wasn't a fantastical romance between Michelle Paet and Michael Rodriguez. It wasn't that at all. It was like a short tryst in the backseat of Michael's car, and that's it.
And according to Michelle, she had no idea he was an ex-con.
Michelle, of course, didn't know anything about his criminal history. She just knew that he was a guy who was paying attention to her, and she liked the attention.
I think that on the surface, a woman could see maybe how somebody like Michelle Paet could be initially drawn to Michael Rodriguez. I mean, it's age-old. Women are attracted to the bad boy, and Michael Rodriguez was certainly that.
However, in hindsight, she did admit that Michael had taken a curious interest in her husband's military benefits.
The conversations went something like this. Hey, Michelle, your husband's in the military. If something happens to him, you make a lot of money from that, don't you?
Somewhere in the midst of talking about Nate's military benefits and the fact that she was unhappy in her marriage, Michelle said their conversations had taken a dark turn.
She tells them that the two of them had been talking about numerous different ways to kill her husband.
It was idle chatter, according to Michelle. At least, that's what she thought it was.
She didn't put thought into this fantasy can actually, not even a fantasy, I would hesitate to call it a fantasy.
Fantasy or not, Michelle claimed that she had never intended it to come true.
Michelle puts all of the blame on Michael Rodriguez.
In fact, Michelle said she didn't even know the other players in the murder plot.
Michelle had never met Corey Hawkins or Jessica Austin.
But did that mean that Michelle was innocent? That she really didn't deserve any blame for her husband's murder?
She didn't know if it would actually take place, and if it was going to take place, she really did not know how to stop it. And that was really how simple Michelle was.
And for the moment, that appeared to satisfy the investigators.
The police told her, okay, thank you, you're free to leave.
Michelle hesitated.
She did not want to face the family because of this horrible thing that she had done.
Eventually, however, she did walk out of the station and into the parking lot where Nate's cousin was still waiting.
He was going to take her to the funeral services that was scheduled for that afternoon.
At least, that was the plan. But things didn't work out that way.
When she got outside, she had a complete and total meltdown.
Screaming, crying, and making threats to herself.
And she was making statements that she was suicidal.
At that point, the police intervened.
She was taken to a psychiatrical hospital for evaluation.
And later that day, while the therapists were evaluating Michelle, the investigators placed Michael Rodriguez, Corey Hawkins, and Jessica Austin under arrest for her husband's murder.
I get a call that they have 3 people in custody. And then, but there's one more possible suspect.
And 2 days later, when Michelle was released from the hospital, the family learned just who the suspect was.
We find out it's my sister.
Once she was released, she was arrested and she was brought to the Clark County Detention Center.
Michelle's family was blindsided by her arrest.
I know that she didn't know this was gonna happen. She loved her husband, and she still loves her husband.
But was that the case? Was Michelle simply a lonely housewife who sought a little excitement with the wrong man? Or was she the seductive manipulator behind her husband's murder? Coming up, the stakes are high when the case goes to court.
The state was seeking the death penalty.
And chilling new evidence casts doubt on Michelle's claims of innocence.
And then she ended that text message with an LOL.
By September of 2015, it had been almost 5 years since Michelle Paet's husband had been murdered in the couple's suburban Las Vegas home.
At first, I thought it was robbery because the houses there are new. Everybody has nice cars. I didn't think anything else of it. Like, why would they hurt him?
But according to the Las Vegas Metro Police and the Clark County DA's office, the murder was actually the result of a conspiracy.
We have 4 individuals. They all are pointing the finger at each other and giving statements implicating each other.
There was the alleged shooter, a 36-year-old ex-con named Michael Rodriguez.
Michael Rodriguez is a hardened criminal. If you needed somebody to help you orchestrate a murder, Michael Rodriguez is your guy.
Michael's fellow ex-con and alleged accomplice, Corey Hawkins, was also charged with the murder.
Corey Hawkins is, of course, the muscle.
It's the state's belief that he hooked up with Michael to get a cut from the money that Michael was going to get.
Corey's girlfriend, Jessica Austin, faced conspiracy charges for destroying evidence and helping to arrange the alibi for Michael and her boyfriend.
Jessica went along with it because Jessica was the type of person that was easily manipulated.
And finally, there was Nathan's wife, Michelle Paet. The 33-year-old mother of 4 faced murder charges for her role in the conspiracy.
I always felt that Michelle Paet was the most culpable person in this case.
She was carrying on an affair with Michael Rodriguez.
Questioned by the police, she had also admitted to being dissatisfied with her marriage, as well as admitting she discussed killing Nathan with Michael, discussions she had tried to portray as mere fantasy.
She tries to distance herself, say that she actually didn't want this to happen. She tries to say that she tried to stop it from happening.
But the investigators hadn't believed her, and neither did the prosecutors.
She is the person who told Michael Rodriguez that she had close to $650,000 in life insurance policies for her husband.
He took the full hook, line, and sinker. Once he knew how much money Nathan Paet's life was worth, he was game.
This girl knew exactly what she was doing from the minute that she met Michael Rodriguez.
However, while the prosecutors were convinced that Michelle was the key player in the murder conspiracy, could they convince a jury?
Michelle had absolutely no criminal history. She had no criminal past.
The only thing that she has on her record was a ticket when she just had her driver's permit.
And she didn't exactly look like a criminal mastermind either.
She looks very small, very meek. She looks vulnerable.
So when it came to putting the conspirators on trial, the prosecutors opted to take the path of least resistance.
The judge correctly ruled that we should have 4 separate trials. And so the first trial to go was Michael Rodriguez.
And when Michael's trial got underway on September 21st, the ex-con didn't just face the prospect of going back to prison.
The state was seeking the death penalty on Michael Rodriguez.
Michael was the person who pulled the trigger and killed her husband.
Granted, the plot to kill Nathan and collect more than $500,000 in military death benefits did start with Michelle.
She was just basically motivated by money.
But the prosecution claimed that it was meeting Michael that had really set Michelle's plan in motion.
If you want one word to describe Michael Rodriguez is, quite frankly, he's a scoundrel.
This guy was going to be the perfect person to help her execute the plan of killing her husband.
And the prosecutors claimed that the attractive young woman had no trouble recruiting Michael.
Sex was the big hook.
They would leave the office together. She would perform oral sex on him in parking lots.
But according to the prosecutors, it was the money that sealed the deal.
But for Michelle Paet, Michael Rodriguez never knows about the financial windfall that would come from potentially killing Nathan.
And the prosecutors knew that because they'd heard it directly from Michael.
Michael Rodriguez, after he got arrested, confesses to his involvement.
And as part of his confession, Michael said that Michelle promised to pay him $150,000 for the murder.
He said he was motivated by the money that he was going to get.
And once Michael was on board, he and Michelle began talking about ways to get rid of her husband.
And this is something that had been planned for months between he and Michelle.
But it was on December 1st of 2010, after arranging an alibi and recruiting Corey Hawkins, that Michael and Michelle went through with their plans.
The original plan was to have her husband kidnapped.
They would then take him out to the desert, kill him, and then they would leave his body to rot.
And to back up Michael's statement, the prosecutors had additional evidence they said proved that Michelle and Michael had cooperated to lay a trap for her husband.
There were a number of text messages immediately before her husband was murdered.
This is just minutes before her husband leaves to go to work.
She then started text messaging with Michael to let him know that her husband was late, but that he would be leaving the house momentarily.
A message sent at 11:24 p.m., when, according to the prosecutors, Michael and Corey were already waiting outside the house, ready to ambush Nate.
She ended that text message with an LOL.
And moments later, when Nate had opened the garage door, Michael and Corey were waiting to abduct him at gunpoint.
He was told to sit down or hold his hands up. They thought that he would surrender.
But the plan had immediately gone awry.
Nathan ran back into the house where he wanted to protect his family.
Nate is not somebody that, gives up easy. He wasn't going to go down without a fight.
The moment he started racing back to the house, gunfire erupted.
And he died without knowing just how badly Michelle had betrayed him.
The person that he was going back into the house to try to protect was the one who set him up.
When it was their turn, Michael's defense didn't deny that he'd been there the night Michelle's husband was killed.
The defense for Michael was really focused more on fighting the death penalty.
And in order to do that, they tried to shift the blame.
He tries to put most of the blame on Corey, that Corey Hawkins is the person that uses the gun to actually kill Nathan.
But would it matter to the jury exactly whose finger was on the trigger?
Under the law, if both co-conspirators are principals of the crime, that they're both active, involved in seeing or pursuing a particular crime, regardless of who the shooter is, both are legally equally liable for that death.
On September 25th, the jury announced the verdict.
It did not take this jury very long to convict Michael Rodriguez.
But before the jury reconvened to decide Michael's sentence, it would be Michelle's turn in court.
When she was telling me, I'm going to fight. I'm going to fight.
And the fight could cost Michelle her life.
Death was absolutely on the table for Michelle Paet.
Coming up, Michelle has her day in court.
The defense certainly tried to paint her as shocked and surprised.
But will the court really condemn the mother of four to death?
Give her the possibility to get out and reunite with her.
On October 1st, 2015, 4 years and 10 months after her husband had been shot dead in their Las Vegas garage, 33-year-old Michelle Paet stood in a Clark County, Nevada court, accused of orchestrating his murder.
There was only one person who could have gotten the ball rolling.
The man charged with actually shooting her husband, 36-year-old Michael Rodriguez, had been found guilty a week earlier.
He had been convicted of first-degree murder.
And while his sentence had yet to be decided, he faced the death penalty.
The death penalty was absolutely in play in this case.
Which may explain why, just days before her case was scheduled to go to trial, her attorney approached the prosecutors with an offer.
If we agreed to withdraw the death penalty, she was willing to plead guilty.
And on October 1st, a sobbing and emotional Michelle did just that.
I made a huge mistake and a really bad choice. And I'm so sorry.
Michelle pled guilty because she feels responsible for Nathan's death.
Michelle's sudden plea caught her family entirely by surprise.
I really thought she was gonna fight. And then next thing you know, she's not gonna fight.
According to her attorney, Michelle had no choice but to make a deal.
We knew Michelle Paet was going to be found guilty of first-degree murder.
Although at her sentencing in March of 2016, Michelle still tried to portray the murder as nothing more than a fantasy on her part.
The defense certainly tried to paint her as shocked and surprised when it did happen.
Would her fantasy scenario be enough to earn her a shot at parole?
Give her the possibility to get out and reunite with her children at some point in her life.
Or would the fact that she'd murdered her children's father sway the judge?
So ultimately, the judge gave Michelle life without the possibility of parole.
Michelle Paet living the rest of her life in custody is as much justice as you can get for a case like this.
Michelle's family disagrees.
I honestly believe that she's innocent.
She was talking to Michael Rodriguez, but that doesn't make her a killer.
And Michelle's attorney is convinced that Michelle's sentence was a miscarriage of justice.
I was shocked with the outcome. I think our prison systems are too full already to have Michelle in prison for the rest of her life.
Because no matter how satisfying it might be for Nate's family, putting Michelle in prison for life won't bring him back.
You can't put a value on humans' life. What was Nathan Paet's life worth?
Though some would argue that Michelle knew precisely how much her husband's life was worth.
She wanted to be free. She wanted her kids and the $650,000.
The thought of losing Nathan, her decent, honest, hardworking husband, didn't really seem to matter.
On the morning of October 27, 2018, people gathered in Squirrel Hill, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for something that had happened countless times before. A Saturday gathering within a Jewish community, on the Sabbath, a day of religious observance and prayer. Inside the Tree of Life synagogue complex, members of three congregations, Tree of Life, Dor Hadash, and New Light, were present. Nothing in the basic rhythm of that morning could have suggested that before the day was over, 11 people would be dead, 2 others would be seriously wounded, and several police officers would be injured while trying to stop the man responsible. The building was not simply a location on a map. It was a place where members of a community came together to practice their religion. Yet on that morning, Robert Gregory Bowers arrived carrying multiple firearms, and the purpose of his visit was violence. According to the federal case record supplied for this account, Bowers was armed with a Colt AR-15 and 3 Glock .357 handguns. He approached the building and shot through a window at the front before entering. What followed would last less than 13 minutes. In that brief period, 11 people would lose their lives. Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner would be seriously wounded. Police officers responding to the attack would also come under fire, and a place associated with worship and community would become the center of one of the most serious anti-Semitic attacks in modern American history. The name Robert Bowers would soon become inseparable from the shooting. But beginning this story with his name alone risks placing the wrong person at its center. A true crime story can easily become a story about the offender, his beliefs, his actions, his weapons, his words, the details of his arrest, and the punishment that eventually followed. But the people inside the Tree of Life complex were not characters created for a crime story. They were members of a community who had gathered for religious life. They had names, and those names would later become part of the official record of a mass killing. Joyce Feinberg was 75. Richard Gottfried was 65. Rose Mallinger was 97, the oldest of the 11 victims. Jerry Rabinowitz was 66. Cecil Rosenthal was 59. David Rosenthal was 54. Bernice Simon was 84. Sylvan Simon was 86. Daniel Stein was 71. Melvin Wax was 87. Irving Younger was 69. Their ages alone reveal something about the human scale of what happened. Several of the victims were elderly, and one was 97 years old. But the numbers do not tell us who these people were beyond the basic facts preserved in the case. And that distinction matters. There is a temptation, when recounting a crime of this magnitude, to fill the silence around victims with invented details, to imagine what they were thinking, what they might have said, what they expected from the morning, or what their final moments must have felt like. But those details are not part of the information available here, and they do not need to be invented. What can be said with certainty is simpler and in some ways more powerful. These 11 people were present in a Jewish religious community when they were attacked. 2 others survived serious wounds. Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner became direct survivors of the violence. Their presence in the story is important because the shooting did not end with 11 deaths. It left people alive who had been directly caught in the attack, as well as others who escaped without physical injury. And outside the building, another group was moving toward danger. Police officers responding to the emergency encountered an armed attacker who was not only firing inside the synagogue complex, but also shooting toward the officers who came to confront him. SWAT officers subsequently entered the building as the effort to stop Bowers and protect those still inside continued. The Supply Department of Justice material records that 5 officers were injured during the response and arrest, although another judicial document specifically describes 4 officers being shot. Rather than erase that discrepancy, it is important to acknowledge it. In a case this serious, precision matters, even when 2 official descriptions do not use exactly the same number. What is beyond dispute from the supplied material is that law enforcement officers were injured while responding to the attack. Eventually, Bowers was taken into custody. 2 days later, on October 29th, he appeared for the first time in federal court and was held without bail. But by then, investigators already had an important question to answer. Why this place? Why these people? Why a Jewish synagogue on a Saturday morning? The answer would not be found only in the physical scene. It would also be found in the digital traces Bowers had left behind before the shooting. Robert Gregory Bowers, born in 1953 and living in Baldwin, Pennsylvania, had been active on the social media platform Gab. According to the evidence later presented at trial, his online activity contained anti-Semitic material, hostility toward immigrants, white supremacist views, opposition to HIS, and expressions connected to violence. HIS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, is an organization that assists refugees and immigrants, and Bowers had specifically targeted the organization in his online statements. He portrayed the people associated with immigration as invaders, revealing that his hostility was not simply abstract prejudice, but part of the ideological framework surrounding his actions. The FBI's evidence would later indicate that the attack had been planned rather than being entirely spontaneous. In the days immediately before the shooting, Bowers had also posted an extreme anti-Semitic message on Gab. That digital record would become significant when investigators and prosecutors attempted to establish motive. The most direct evidence, however, would come from Bowers himself. According to the case records, after his arrest, he made a statement expressing his desire to kill Jews. "I just want to kill Jews." In the legal process that followed, that statement became important because prosecutors were not merely trying to establish that Bowers had killed people. They were seeking to establish why he had targeted them and how the attack related to their religion. The distinction would become central to the federal case. On October 31st, 2018, a federal grand jury indicted Bowers on 44 counts, including charges involving interference with religious exercise, murder, firearms, injuries to victims, and injuries to law enforcement officers. 3 months later, on January 29, 2019, a superseding indictment expanded the case to 63 counts. Among those charges were offenses under the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. The legal case would eventually take years to reach trial, but the essential outline was already becoming clear. An armed man had entered a Jewish religious gathering. 11 people had been killed. Survivors and police officers had been wounded, and evidence of anti-Semitic ideology existed both online and in statements attributed to the defendant after his arrest. Yet the full meaning of the case could not be understood simply by counting victims, listing weapons, or reading charges from an indictment. The story began with a community gathering on a Saturday morning. It ended, for 11 people, with their lives taken. For 2 survivors, it continued with the consequences of serious wounds. For responding officers, it became an encounter with an armed attacker. And for the investigators who began assembling the case, it became a search for the connection between ideology, intent, evidence, and murder. Before the courtroom, before the verdict, before the death sentence, there was that morning in Squirrel Hill, a morning that began with people coming together to practice their faith, and ended with a crime that would reverberate far beyond the walls of the Tree of Life complex. Before Robert Bowers became the central figure in the legal record, before investigators began examining his online activity, and before prosecutors built a federal case around the evidence, there were 11 people whose lives were about to be permanently reduced to the words victims of the Tree of Life shooting. That description is legally accurate, but it is also painfully incomplete. A victim list can tell us how many people died. It can tell us their names and ages. It can establish the scale of a crime, but numbers alone cannot explain what was lost. On October 27, 2018, the people inside the Tree of Life synagogue complex had not gathered because they expected to become part of American criminal history. They were there because the building was being used by 3 Jewish congregations: Tree of Life, Dor Hadash, and New Light. It was Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, and members of these communities were gathered for religious activities and prayer. The supplied information does not give us detailed biographies of each victim, and that absence matters. It would be easy to fill the gaps with imagined conversations, invented memories, or assumptions about what individual people were thinking that morning. But a careful account should not manufacture intimacy where the evidence does not provide it. Instead, their names and ages can be allowed to stand on their own. Joyce Feinberg was 75 years old. Richard Gottfried was 65. Rose Mallinger was 97, the oldest of the 11 victims. Jerry Rabinowitz was 66. Cecil Rosenthal was 59. David Rosenthal was 54. Bernice Simon was 84. Sylvan Simon was 86. Daniel Stein was 71. Melvin Wax was 87. Irving Younger was 69. 11 names. 11 lives. 11 people whose presence in that building on that Saturday morning ended in violence. Among them was Rose Mallinger, 97 years old. Her age makes her the oldest confirmed victim in the supplied account. But the number itself should not become a spectacle. It is simply another fact in a case filled with difficult facts. The same is true of the other ages. Some were in their 50s and 60s. Others were in their 70s and 80s. Several were elderly. Their different ages remind us that the attack did not reduce its victims to one particular stage of life. What connected them, according to the federal case, was the religious setting in which they were attacked. They were Jewish people gathered within a Jewish community. That fact became central to the prosecution's theory of the crime because investigators and prosecutors alleged that Bowers had specifically targeted them because they were Jewish. The Tree of Life complex was therefore more than the physical scene of 11 murders. It was the setting in which religious practice, community, and violence collided. The presence of 3 congregations is significant. Tree of Life, Dor Hadash, and New Light were distinct communities. But on that Saturday morning, their members were gathered within the same complex. The attack consequently affected more than one congregation. The crime reached into a shared religious space, turning a place of gathering into the scene of a mass killing. The supplied information does not allow us to reconstruct precisely where every victim was standing, what each person was doing immediately before the shooting, or what individual witnesses saw at every moment. Those details should not be invented simply to make the narrative more cinematic. The known facts are sufficient to establish the gravity of what happened. Bowers entered the building after shooting through a front window. He opened fire on people participating in religious activities. The attack lasted less than 13 minutes. 11 people were killed. 2 others were seriously wounded. Those 2 survivors were Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner. Their names are important because they demonstrate that the consequences of the attack cannot be measured solely by the number 11. There were also people who survived without physical injury, and there were police officers who would arrive while the attack was still underway. Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner were direct survivors of the violence. The supplied case material does not provide enough information to reconstruct their personal experiences in detail, and therefore this account will not invent what they thought or felt during those moments. What can be established is that both were seriously wounded and survived. Their survival placed them in a category that is sometimes overlooked in the aftermath of mass violence. People who continue living with an event that cannot be undone. The police response created another group of victims. Once officers arrived, the danger did not simply disappear. According to the supplied information, Bowers fired toward responding officers, and SWAT officers eventually entered the building as authorities attempted to stop him and protect those who remained inside. Officers were injured during the response. The supplied records contain a discrepancy in the number. One Department of Justice account identifies 5 officers as injured during the response and arrest, while another judicial document specifically describes 4 officers being shot. The important point is not to force the 2 figures into a false certainty. The evidence clearly establishes that law enforcement officers were injured while responding to the attack. Their injuries were part of the immediate human cost of the shooting, alongside the deaths of the 11 members of the Jewish community and the serious wounds suffered by the 2 surviving victims. But the center of this story remains the people who had gathered for worship. That is important because mass shootings can easily be narrated through statistics. 11 dead. 2 seriously wounded. Officers injured. 63 federal counts. 22 death-eligible convictions. Each number is precise, but precision can sometimes create emotional distance. 11 is a number. Joyce Feinberg is a name. 65 is an age. Richard Gottfried is a person. 97 is an age. Rose Mallinger is a name. A list cannot restore what was taken, but it can prevent the victims from disappearing completely behind the identity of their killer. The contrast is especially important in a case where the perpetrator's ideology became such a significant part of the evidence. Bowers had left behind online statements expressing anti-Semitic beliefs, hostility toward immigrants, and opposition to HIS. Those statements would later become central to establishing motive. But the reason those statements mattered was not because the ideology itself was the story. It mattered because that ideology was alleged to have provided the motive for attacking real people. The victims were not symbols. They were human beings who happened to be in a place where Bowers decided to direct his hatred. The legal system would eventually examine that connection in great detail. Prosecutors would have to establish that the attack was connected to the victim's religious identity, and that Bowers intentionally interfered with their ability to practice their religion. But before those questions reached a courtroom, the basic human fact was already clear. 11 people had been killed while gathered within a Jewish religious community. The mourning that began with separate congregations sharing a building would become a defining moment for all 3. The names of the victims would be recorded in police reports, federal filings, trial evidence, and public memorials. Their ages would be documented. Their deaths would become part of the factual foundation of one of the largest federal hate crime prosecutions in American history. Yet none of those legal categories can fully describe what a community loses when 11 of its members do not return home. Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, Irving Younger. These are the names that should remain at the center of the story. Robert Bowers would eventually receive a sentence. The federal case would eventually reach a verdict. The evidence would eventually be organized into charges and exhibits. But none of that changes the first and most important fact. The case exists because 11 people died. On that Saturday morning, they were members of a religious community. By the end of the morning, they had become victims of a deliberate attack. And the question that followed was not simply who had done it. Investigators also had to determine why. To answer that question, they would have to look beyond the walls of the Tree of Life complex and into the digital record Bowers had created before the shooting, a record that would help prosecutors build the connection between his ideology, his stated hatred, and the violence that followed. Robert Bowers did not become known to the wider public because of the shooting alone. By the time investigators began examining the events of October 27, 2018, they were also confronted with something that had existed before the attack: a digital record of anti-Semitic beliefs and extremist ideas associated with the man who had entered the Tree of Life synagogue complex. That record would become one of the most important elements in understanding the prosecution's theory of motive. It would also create a difficult distinction that would remain important throughout the case. There was a difference between knowing what Bowers had written and deciding what those words ultimately meant in relation to the crime. Robert Gregory Bowers was born in 1953 and lived in Baldwin, Pennsylvania. Before the shooting, he had been active on the social media platform Gab. According to the evidence described in the supplied Department of Justice material, his activity there included anti-Semitic content, hostility toward immigrants, white supremacist views, opposition to the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and statements associated with violence. These were not details discovered only after the shooting in an attempt to construct a motive from nothing. His online activity existed before October 27th. After the shooting, investigators were able to examine that material as part of the evidence surrounding the case. The significance of the digital record was straightforward but profound. A person who commits an act of mass violence may leave behind many questions about intent. Was the attack spontaneous? Was the target chosen randomly? Was there a personal dispute? Was the location accidental? In this case, investigators found evidence that pointed in a very different direction. Bowers had expressed hostility toward Jews before he arrived at the synagogue. He had also focused his anger on immigration and on HIS, an organization that assists Jewish refugees and immigrants. The supplied information states that Bowers had posted material portraying people associated with immigration as invaders. That language was significant because it showed how his hostility toward Jews, immigrants, and HIS had become connected within his worldview. It would be wrong, however, to turn that evidence into a simplistic explanation of the entire man. The available data does not provide enough information to reconstruct his personal history, diagnose his mental state, or identify a single moment when his beliefs supposedly began. Nor does it justify claiming that every person who encounters extremist material will become violent. Those conclusions would go beyond the evidence. What the evidence does establish is narrower and more important. Bowers expressed anti-Semitic and extremist beliefs online. He had specifically criticized HIS and immigration, and prosecutors later used those expressions to establish motive in a case involving the murder of Jewish worshippers. That distinction between evidence and speculation is especially important in true crime storytelling. The temptation is to create a psychological portrait so complete that the offender seems inevitable, as though every event in his life was moving toward the shooting. Real criminal cases are rarely that simple. What can be documented is what a person said, what a person did, what investigators found, and what a jury ultimately accepted as proven beyond a reasonable doubt. In Bowers's case, the online record became particularly significant because of its proximity to the attack. According to the supplied material, only days before the shooting, he posted an extreme anti-Semitic message on Gab. Later federal appellate material cited that post as part of the evidence concerning his ideology. The timing mattered. It meant investigators were not looking only at statements made years earlier or at beliefs that might have changed over time. They were examining material posted shortly before the attack itself. The FBI's evidence, according to the supplied information, indicated that the shooting had been planned rather than being entirely spontaneous. That finding strengthened the importance of the online material. If the attack had been an impulsive act unrelated to any identifiable motive, the posts might have been treated differently. But when combined with evidence of preparation, the statements became part of a larger picture. The prosecution's argument was not simply that Bowers disliked Jews. It was that his anti-Semitic ideology was connected to a deliberate decision to attack people gathered for Jewish religious practice. The location therefore mattered. The Tree of Life complex was not presented as an accidental target. It was a Jewish religious setting, and the people inside belonged to Jewish congregations. The connection between place, victims, ideology, and action would become one of the central issues in the federal case. There was also the question of HIS. Bowers's hostility toward the organization was particularly relevant because his work involved refugees and immigrants, including Jewish people. In the supplied account, Bowers accused HIS of bringing what he described as invaders into the United States. His statements therefore provided investigators with another piece of evidence showing how immigration, Jews, and conspiracy-based hostility were connected in his online worldview. Again, the evidence does not require speculation about what happened inside his mind. The posts themselves were part of the record. The later attack was a physical act. The prosecution's task was to demonstrate the connection between the two. That connection became even more direct after Bowers was arrested. According to the case records, he made a statement expressing his desire to kill Jews. "I just want to kill Jews." The sentence was brief, but legally significant. Investigators and prosecutors did not need to interpret an obscure metaphor or guess what he meant by a complicated political statement. The words directly expressed hostility toward Jews and were used as evidence of the religious motivation behind the attack. The statement also became important because the federal government was not prosecuting the case merely as a series of murders. The charges included allegations that Bowers had intentionally interfered with the victims' freedom to practice their religion because they were Jewish. That made motive a central component of the prosecution's case. The digital record and the statement after arrest therefore served complementary purposes. The online posts demonstrated that anti-Semitic beliefs existed before the shooting. The statement after arrest provided direct evidence of his hostility toward Jews. The physical crime itself demonstrated the violence that followed. Together, these elements formed the framework around which the federal prosecution would eventually be built. But the investigation did not stop at ideology. Authorities also had to establish the basic facts of the shooting, that Bowers was the attacker, that 11 people had been killed, that Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner had been seriously wounded, and that responding police officers had been injured. The evidence concerning weapons, the location, the attack itself, and the defendant's conduct had to be assembled into a coherent criminal case. The online material was therefore one part of a much larger evidentiary picture. It was important because it helped explain motive, but motive alone does not establish murder. The prosecution still had to prove the acts themselves and prove that they satisfied the specific elements of the federal charges. By the time the investigation moved toward federal prosecution, a basic narrative had emerged. On October 27, 2018, Robert Bowers entered a Jewish religious complex in Pittsburgh carrying multiple firearms. He opened fire on people gathered there. 11 were killed. 2 were seriously wounded. Police responding to the attack were also injured. Before the shooting, Bowers had left behind a record of anti-Semitic and extremist statements online. After his arrest, he made a direct statement expressing his desire to kill Jews. and investigators had evidence indicating that the attack had been planned. None of these facts, considered in isolation, tells the entire story. Together, however, they provided prosecutors with the foundation for arguing that this was not random violence. It was an intentional attack motivated by hatred toward the people inside. The next stage would be legal rather than investigative. On October 31st, 2018, only days after the shooting, a federal grand jury indicted Bowers on 44 counts. The charges involved interference with religious exercise, murder, firearms, injuries to victims, and injuries to law enforcement officers. Then, on January 29, 2019, a superseding indictment expanded the case to 63 counts, including charges under the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. The number of charges reflected the complexity of the case. But behind those 63 counts was one central allegation: that Bowers had deliberately used violence against Jewish worshippers because they were Jewish. The investigation had begun with a crime scene. It had expanded into a search of digital evidence, statements, weapons, victims, survivors, and police injuries. Now the evidence would have to survive the much stricter test of a federal courtroom. And in that courtroom, the question would no longer be simply what investigators believed had happened. The question would be whether the government could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. The morning of October 27, 2018, had begun as a day of religious observance. It was Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, and inside the Tree of Life synagogue complex in Pittsburgh's Squirrel Hill neighborhood, members of 3 Jewish congregations, Tree of Life, Dor Hadash, and New Light, were gathered for religious activities and prayer. Within the federal case that followed, those ordinary facts would become the starting point of a murder investigation, a hate crime prosecution, and eventually a capital case. But at the moment the attack began, none of those legal categories existed. There was only a building, a religious community, and an armed man approaching it. Robert Gregory Bowers arrived carrying multiple firearms. According to the Supply Department of Justice material, those weapons included 1 Colt AR-15 and 3 Glock .357 handguns. The presence of those weapons was not incidental to the case. They would become part of the evidence used to establish how the attack was carried out and why. Federal firearm charges were included in the indictment. Bowers approached the building and shot through a window at the front before entering. From that point, the situation became an active mass shooting inside a Jewish religious complex. The available information does not provide a complete second-by-second reconstruction of every movement made by Bowers or every action taken by the people inside. It does not provide enough verified detail to recreate individual conversations, exact positions, or private thoughts. Those details should not be invented simply to make the story more dramatic. What is known is already devastating. Once inside, Bowers opened fire on people who were participating in religious activities. The attack lasted less than 13 minutes, according to the judicial material supplied for this account. In fewer than 13 minutes, 11 people were killed. 2 others, Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner, were seriously wounded. The number is difficult to absorb because the period of time was so short. Less than 13 minutes is a measure normally associated with an ordinary segment of a day. It can describe part of a meeting, a short journey, or a brief interruption. Here, it marked the span between the beginning of an attack and the point at which the violence was brought under control. 11 people would not leave the building alive. The victims were Joyce Feenberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, and Irving Younger. Their ages range from 54 to 97. The oldest was Rose Mallinger, who was 97. The attack, therefore, did not select victims according to age in any meaningful human sense. The people killed represented different generations within the community. Their common connection, according to the federal prosecution, was the religious setting in which they were gathered. That point would later become central to the hate crime charges, but during the shooting it translated into something much more immediate. People practicing their religion had become the targets of armed violence. Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner survived after being seriously wounded. Their survival is one of the essential facts of the incident because it shows that the shooting did not produce only two possible outcomes. Some people died, some were wounded, others survived without physical injury. The building contained people whose experiences of the attack were therefore different, but all were caught within the same rapidly unfolding event. The federal case would later distinguish between these categories when prosecutors brought separate charges concerning deaths, surviving victims, and injured law enforcement officers. Outside the building, police were beginning to respond. The attack had triggered an emergency response, and officers arrived while Bowers remained inside. At that point, the danger was not confined to the people gathered for worship. According to the supplied material, Bowers also fired toward the responding police officers. This changed the nature of the response. Officers were not simply arriving after a completed crime to investigate a scene. They were confronting an armed attacker while the incident was still unfolding. SWAT officers subsequently entered the building as authorities attempted to stop Bowers and protect those who remained inside. The supplied records state that Bowers continued to resist and fired toward members of the responding tactical team. Several officers were injured during the response and arrest. One Department of Justice account identifies 5 officers as injured during the response and arrest, while another judicial document specifically describes 4 officers being shot. The discrepancy is worth preserving because accuracy matters, rather than turning 2 different official descriptions into an artificial certainty. The responsible account is that law enforcement officers were injured during the response, with the supplied federal materials differing over the precise number described. What is not in dispute is that the police response itself became part of the violence. Officers entered a dangerous environment because people were still inside and the attacker had not yet been stopped. Eventually, Bowers was taken into custody. The immediate attack was over. The physical violence had lasted less than 13 minutes, but the consequences would continue for years. 11 people had been killed. 2 people had suffered serious wounds. Police officers had been injured. A Jewish community had experienced a direct attack within a place of religious gathering. And investigators now had to begin transforming the chaos of the incident into a sequence of provable facts. That process would matter because the case against Bowers would not depend solely on the existence of a horrific crime. Prosecutors would eventually have to demonstrate that he was responsible for the killings and injuries, that his actions met the legal requirements of the charges, and that the attack was connected to the victim's religious identity. The physical scene would provide one category of evidence. The weapons associated with Bowers would provide another. The deaths and injuries would establish the consequences. But the question of motive would require investigators to look beyond the building itself. That evidence would eventually lead them back to the digital record Bowers had created before the shooting. The incident also raised an important distinction between what happened during those 13 minutes and what would later be argued about them. The attack itself was an observable act of violence. The interpretation of its motive was a matter that investigators and prosecutors had to establish through evidence. The government would argue that Bowers had deliberately targeted the Jewish community because of his anti-Semitic beliefs. The evidence supporting that theory included his online activity, his hostility toward HIS, his statements concerning Jews and immigrants, and his statement after arrest, "I just want to kill Jews." But those pieces of evidence would have to be placed within the larger factual structure of the case. The investigation could not simply begin with ideology and work backward. It had to establish what happened inside the Tree of Life complex and connect the defendant to those actions. By the time Bowers was arrested, the central facts were already stark. A man carrying multiple firearms had entered a Jewish religious complex on a Saturday morning. He had opened fire on people gathered there. 11 people had been killed. Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner had been seriously wounded. Responding police officers had also been injured. The attack had ended only after law enforcement confronted and arrested Bowers. But a crime scene does not explain itself. Investigators would now have to reconstruct what had happened and determine what evidence could survive scrutiny in court. 2 days after the shooting, on October 29th, Bowers appeared for the first time in federal court and was held without bail. 2 days later, on October 31st, a federal grand jury indicted him on 44 counts. Those initial charges included interference with religious exercise, murder, firearms offenses, and charges related to injuries suffered by victims and law enforcement officers. The legal response was already beginning to take shape, but the investigation was far from over. On January 29, 2019, a superseding indictment expanded the case to 63 counts. Among them were charges under the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, reflecting the government's allegation that the victims had been targeted because they were Jewish. The shooting itself had been short. The legal process would be long. Less than 13 minutes had produced 11 deaths, serious injuries, and a confrontation with police. But establishing what those 13 minutes meant in legal terms would take years. Investigators would have to examine evidence piece by piece. Prosecutors would have to connect those pieces into a case. And eventually, a jury would have to decide whether the government had proved its allegations beyond a reasonable doubt. The gunfire had ended inside the Tree of Life complex, but the search for answers had only begun. Once Robert Bowers had been taken into custody, the immediate danger inside the Tree of Life synagogue complex had ended, but for investigators, the most difficult part of the case was only beginning. A crime of this scale produces an enormous number of questions. Who was responsible? What exactly had happened inside the building? Why had this particular religious community been targeted? Was the shooting an impulsive act, or had it been planned? And, perhaps most importantly for a federal prosecution, could investigators establish that the victims had been targeted because they were Jewish? The answers would have to come from evidence rather than assumption. The physical scene established the consequences of the attack. 11 people were dead. Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner had been seriously wounded. Police officers had also been injured while responding. But the physical scene alone could not fully explain motive. To understand why Bowers had come to the Tree of Life complex, investigators had to examine what he had said and done before the shooting. That investigation led directly into his online activity. Before October 27, 2018, Bowers had maintained an active presence on Gab, where he posted anti-Semitic material and expressed extremist views. According to the supplied federal case information, his posts included hostility toward Jews, immigrants, and HIS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. His online statements also reflected white supremacist ideas and attitudes associated with violence. For investigators, this material was significant because it existed before the shooting. It was not simply a collection of statements created after his arrest to explain an otherwise inexplicable crime. The posts provided a record of beliefs that prosecutors would later argue were connected directly to the attack. HIS became particularly important within that record. The organization assists Jewish refugees and immigrants, and Bowers had directed hostility toward it. He had posted claims portraying immigrants connected with the organization as invaders. Within the larger evidence of the case, this helped prosecutors establish a link between his views about immigration, his hostility toward Jews, and his eventual decision to attack a Jewish religious gathering. The distinction between evidence and speculation was crucial. The existence of hateful posts did not, by itself, prove that Bowers would commit murder. Nor would it be accurate to claim that every expression of extremist ideology inevitably leads to violence. What investigators could establish was much more specific. Bowers had expressed anti-Semitic and extremist beliefs. He had focused particular hostility on HIS and immigration, and he later carried out an attack in a Jewish religious setting in which 11 people were killed. The federal prosecution would ask a jury to consider whether those facts were connected. Another important piece of evidence concerned the timing of Bowers's online activity. According to the supplied information, only days before the shooting, he posted an extreme anti-Semitic message on Gab. That post later appeared in federal appellate material as part of the evidence concerning his ideology. The timing gave the statement additional significance because it placed an expression of anti-Semitic hostility very close to the date of the attack. Investigators were not merely examining an old political opinion. They were examining a digital record that existed immediately before a mass shooting of Jewish worshippers. The FBI also presented evidence indicating that the attack had been planned rather than being entirely spontaneous. That conclusion mattered because planning could help establish intent. The prosecution would eventually argue that Bowers did not simply encounter an opportunity for violence and act without thought. Instead, the evidence suggested that he had decided to carry out an attack and that the Jewish religious community was a deliberate target. The online record, therefore, became part of a larger chain of evidence, ideology, statements, preparation, location, victims, and action. Each element had to be considered in relation to the others. Then there was the statement Bowers made after his arrest. According to the case records, he said, "I just want to kill Jews." The sentence was direct, and its relevance to the case was difficult to miss. Prosecutors relied upon it as evidence of religious motivation. It helped connect the defendant's own words to the identity of the people he had attacked. Legally, that connection was crucial. The federal government was not prosecuting Bowers solely for the fact that 11 people had died. The charges also alleged that he had intentionally interfered with the victims' ability to practice their religion because they were Jewish. To prove those charges, prosecutors needed evidence showing that the attack was connected to the victim's religious identity. The statement after arrest became one part of that evidentiary picture. The online posts provided another. The fact that the attack occurred inside a Jewish religious complex provided another. And the selection of the victims provided the physical reality against which all of those pieces had to be examined. The investigation therefore developed along two related tracks. One track concerned the mechanics of the crime, the building, the weapons, the victims, the survivors, the police response, and Bowers's arrest. The other concerned motive and intent, his online activity, his statements, his hostility toward Jews and HIS, and evidence indicating that the attack had been planned. The two tracks had to meet in court. The government needed to prove not only that Bowers had committed the acts, but that those acts satisfied the elements of the specific federal offenses charged. On October 31, 2018, only 4 days after the shooting, a federal grand jury indicted Bowers on 44 counts. The charges included interference with religious exercise, murder, firearm offenses, and offenses related to injuries suffered by victims and law enforcement officers. The indictment represented an important transition. The investigation was no longer simply an effort to understand what had happened. It had become a formal federal criminal prosecution, but the case would grow even larger. On January 29, 2019, prosecutors filed a superseding indictment containing 63 counts. Among the new and expanded allegations were charges under the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, the federal law used in cases involving certain acts motivated by protected characteristics such as religion. The legal structure of the case reflected the government's central theory. Bowers had intentionally attacked Jewish worshippers because they were Jewish, and his actions had interfered with their religious exercise. The 63 counts could therefore be understood as different legal descriptions of the consequences of one event. 11 people had died. 2 people had survived serious wounds. Police officers had been injured. Firearms had been used. And, according to prosecutors, the violence had been motivated by religious hatred. Each category mattered because each required the government to satisfy particular legal elements. The investigation also established an important distinction between accusation and proof. An indictment is not a conviction. It represents the government's allegations and the charges approved by a grand jury. At this stage of the case, Bowers had been accused of the 63 offenses, but he had not yet been found guilty of them. That would not happen until the trial years later. The investigation had produced evidence that prosecutors believed was strong enough to take the case forward. But the ultimate decision would belong to a jury. This distinction is particularly important in a case as emotionally overwhelming as the Tree of Life. Shooting. The deaths were undeniable, but criminal law requires more than horror. It requires proof. Prosecutors had to demonstrate that Bowers was responsible, that his conduct met the elements of each offense, and that the evidence supported the allegations beyond a reasonable doubt. The online posts, the statement after arrest, the evidence of planning, the physical attack, the victims, the survivors, and the injuries to police would all become part of that larger legal picture. The turning point in the investigation was therefore not a single piece of evidence that magically explained everything. It was the accumulation of evidence. The physical crime established what had happened. The digital record helped explain what Bowers believed. His statement after arrest provided an unusually direct indication of his hostility toward Jews. Evidence of planning helped establish intent. The federal charges translated those facts into specific legal allegations. And the superseding indictment transformed the case into a 63-count federal prosecution. By this stage, the basic questions surrounding the shooting had become much clearer. Robert Bowers had been identified as the attacker. 11 people had been killed. 2 had survived serious wounds. Police officers had been injured. Evidence indicated that the attack had been planned. Evidence also indicated that Bowers's anti-Semitic beliefs were directly connected to his choice of target. But the most important test had yet to come. The government had assembled its case. The indictment had been expanded. The evidence had been gathered. Still, none of that was the final word. The final word would belong to a jury. And when that jury eventually heard the case in 2023, the question would no longer be what investigators suspected. It would be whether the evidence was strong enough to establish guilt on all 63 counts. Beyond a reasonable doubt. Nearly 5 years after the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue complex, the case against Robert Bowers finally reached the courtroom. The attack had lasted less than 13 minutes, but the legal process that followed would take years. By the time the trial began in April 2023, the central facts of the case had already been established in the public record. 11 people had been killed, Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner had been seriously wounded, responding law enforcement officers had been injured, and Robert Bowers had been identified as the attacker and charged in federal court. But a criminal trial is not simply a retelling of a tragedy. It is a test of evidence. The government had to prove its allegations beyond a reasonable doubt, and the jury had to decide whether the evidence satisfied the requirements of each charge. The scale of the indictment was enormous. The superseding indictment filed in January 2019 contained 63 counts. Those charges reflected different aspects of the same attack: interference with religious exercise, murders, hate crime allegations, firearm offenses, and charges related to injuries suffered by survivors and law enforcement officers. The prosecution's case, therefore, had to establish more than the fact that a shooting had occurred. It had to establish that Bowers was responsible for the violence and that his conduct met the legal elements of the individual federal offenses. One of the most important issues was motive. The government alleged that Bowers had deliberately attacked people because they were Jewish. That allegation was not based on a single isolated fact. Instead, the prosecution presented a broader body of evidence concerning his conduct and statements. Before the shooting, Bowers had maintained an active presence on Gab, where he posted anti-Semitic material and expressed extremist views. His online activity included hostility toward Jews, immigrants, and HIS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. The evidence also included white supremacist ideas and statements associated with violence. These posts were important because they existed before the attack. They provided investigators and prosecutors with a record of Bowers's beliefs before he entered the synagogue complex. The prosecution also relied on evidence indicating that the shooting had been planned rather than being entirely spontaneous. That mattered because the government was seeking to demonstrate intent. The attack was not presented simply as an unexplained burst of violence. According to the evidence described in the case, Bowers had expressed hostility toward the same religious group whose members he would later attack, and he had prepared to carry out the assault. The location, therefore, became significant. On the morning of October 27, 2018, Bowers went to a Jewish religious complex where members of Tree of Life, Dor Hadash, and New Light were gathered. He arrived carrying multiple firearms, including a Colt AR-15 and 3 Glock .357 handguns, according to the supplied Department of Justice material. He shot through a front window and entered the building. Once inside, he opened fire. 11 people died. 2 others were seriously wounded. The attack also resulted in injuries to responding police officers. These facts formed the physical foundation of the prosecution's case. The online evidence helped address motive and intent, while the events inside the building established the consequences of the defendant's actions. Another important piece of evidence was the statement attributed to Bowers after his arrest. "I just want to kill Jews." In the context of the federal prosecution, those words were significant because they directly expressed hostility toward Jews. The government could use them alongside the online posts and other evidence to argue that the victims had been selected because of their religion. That connection was central to the charges involving religious exercise and federal hate crime law. The prosecution was therefore asking the jury to consider the evidence as a whole. No single fact was required to carry the entire case by itself. The physical evidence showed that an armed attack had occurred. The victims and survivors established its human consequences. The evidence concerning Bowers established his role. His online activity and statements provided evidence concerning his ideology and motive. Evidence indicating planning addressed intent. And the charges translated these facts into specific federal offenses. The case also involved the response of law enforcement. When officers arrived, Bowers did not simply stop. According to the supplied information, he fired toward responding officers, and SWAT personnel entered the building to confront him and protect those who remained inside. Officers were injured during the response. The supplied records differ over the exact number described, with one Department of Justice account identifying 5 officers injured during the response and arrest, and another judicial document specifically describing 4 officers being shot. That distinction remains relevant because the firearm and law enforcement-related charges formed part of the 63-count indictment. The jury, therefore, had to consider not only the deaths of the 11 victims and the serious injuries suffered by the 2 survivors, but also the consequences for officers who entered the building to stop the attack. The trial lasted approximately 2 months. Throughout that process, the distinction between accusation and conviction remained essential. Bowers had been indicted years earlier, but an indictment was not proof of guilt. The government had to present evidence and persuade the jury that the charges had been established beyond a reasonable doubt. This is one of the most important features of the American criminal justice system, particularly in a case involving extraordinary public attention and 11 deaths. The severity of the crime could not substitute for proof. The jury had to evaluate the evidence presented in court. The prosecution's case was built around the connection between Bowers, the shooting, the victims, and the alleged religious motive. The victims had been gathered for Jewish religious activities. Bowers had expressed anti-Semitic beliefs before the attack. His hostility had included Jews, immigrants, and HIS. Evidence indicated that the attack had been planned, and after his arrest, he made a direct statement about killing Jews. Taken together, these facts supported the government's argument that the shooting was not random. The location and identity of the victims were central to the alleged motive. The federal charges reflected that theory by including offenses under the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. The law allowed prosecutors to treat the alleged religious motivation as a specific component of the federal case, rather than leaving the attack solely within the category of ordinary murder charges. By the time the jury reached its decision, it had heard a case involving the deaths of 11 people, serious injuries to 2 survivors, injuries to responding officers, multiple firearms, online evidence, statements attributed to the defendant, and allegations of religiously motivated violence. On June 16, 2023, after approximately 2 months of trial, the jury found Robert Bowers guilty on all 63 counts. The verdict represented a decisive legal turning point. Before the verdict, Bowers was the defendant facing 63 federal charges. After the verdict, he was a convicted offender on every count presented to the jury. 22 of those convictions were eligible for the death penalty. That distinction immediately shifted the case into its next phase. The jury had answered the first question, guilt, but the case was not finished. A separate sentencing process would determine the punishment for the offenses that carried the possibility of death. The prosecution would present aggravating circumstances, while the defense would have an opportunity to present mitigating evidence. The jury would then have to determine whether the most severe punishment available under federal law should be imposed. The facts that had been central to the guilt phase would remain important. 11 people had been killed. The victims had been attacked while gathered for religious activities. The prosecution had presented evidence of anti-Semitic motivation. The attack had been planned according to the evidence described in the case. Responding police officers had been injured. These circumstances would become part of the sentencing phase because they demonstrated the severity and nature of the crimes for which Bowers had been convicted. But even after the guilty verdict, the legal system required another decision. A conviction did not automatically produce a death sentence. The jury had to consider the evidence relevant to punishment and reach a separate conclusion. In July 2023, that process began. On July 13th, the jury determined that Bowers was eligible for the death penalty. From July 17th through July 31st, jurors continued to hear aggravating and mitigating evidence before reaching their final recommendation. The process was now focused on a single question with consequences that would last for the rest of Bowers's life: whether the crimes for which he had been convicted warranted the ultimate punishment. On August 2nd, 2023, the jury answered that question unanimously. It recommended death. The following day, August 3rd, the court formally sentenced Robert Bowers to death on 22 counts. The courtroom process had reached its conclusion, but the verdict did not change the basic fact that had brought the case there in the first place. 11 people were dead. 2 survivors had suffered serious wounds. Police officers had been injured while responding to the attack. And a federal jury had determined that the man responsible was guilty on all 63 counts. The trial had transformed a devastating event into a series of legally established findings. It had tested the evidence, established guilt, and ultimately produced the most severe sentence available under federal law. But the sentence itself was not the end of the story. The consequences of October 27, 2018 could not be contained within a verdict form or a courtroom judgment. For the families and communities connected to the 11 victims, the date remained the point at which lives were permanently divided into before and after. The law could establish responsibility and punishment. It could record the evidence and preserve the names of the dead. But it could not undo what had happened that Saturday morning in Pittsburgh. And that is where the story ultimately has to return, not to the ideology of the perpetrator, not to the weapons, and not even to the final sentence, but to the people whose lives were taken inside a place where they had gathered as a religious community. By the summer of 2023, the question at the center of the Robert Bowers case had changed. For years, investigators and prosecutors had worked to establish what happened inside the Tree of Life synagogue complex and why it happened. The jury had now answered the first and most fundamental legal question. On June 16, 2023, after approximately 2 months of trial, the jury found Bowers guilty on all 63 counts. 22 of those convictions were eligible for the death penalty. The facts that had been examined during the trial now became relevant to a different question. The issue was no longer whether Bowers was responsible for the crimes. The issue was what punishment the law should impose for them. The sentencing phase was not simply a formality following the guilty verdict. In a federal capital case, the jury had to consider aggravating and mitigating circumstances before determining whether the death penalty was appropriate. The process required a separate judgment. A conviction established criminal responsibility. A death sentence required another decision about punishment. For the families and community connected to the 11 people who were killed, the distinction may have seemed almost impossible to separate from the human consequences of the attack. But within the courtroom, the legal process had to move step by step. The jury had found Bowers guilty. Now it had to determine whether the crimes justified the most severe sentence available under federal law. The aggravating circumstances identified in the supplied case information were substantial. 11 people had been killed during the attack. The victims had been gathered for religious activities when they were targeted. The prosecution had presented evidence that Bowers' motivation was anti-Semitic. The attack had been planned, according to the evidence presented in the case. And the violence had extended beyond the people inside the synagogue complex to the officers who arrived to stop the attacker. These circumstances formed the basis for the government's argument for the death penalty. Each one described a different aspect of the severity of the crime. The number of deaths demonstrated the scale of the violence. The religious setting demonstrated the nature of the target. The evidence of anti-Semitic motivation established the alleged reason for the attack. Evidence of planning addressed the deliberate nature of the conduct. And the injuries suffered by law enforcement officers demonstrated that the danger continued even after police arrived. Together, these factors presented the jury with a case involving not one isolated act of violence, but a deliberate attack that produced multiple categories of harm. The religious setting remained especially important. On October 27, 2018, members of Tree of Life, Dor Hadash, and New Light had gathered in the synagogue complex on the Jewish Sabbath. The victims were participating in religious activities when Bowers attacked. The federal prosecution had argued that he deliberately interfered with their freedom to practice their religion because they were Jewish. That allegation was reflected in the charges under federal religious freedom and hate crime laws. By the sentencing phase, the jury had already accepted the prosecution's case on those charges by finding Bowers guilty. The evidence of anti-Semitic motive, therefore, remained an important part of the context in which the jury considered punishment. The online record was also significant. Before the shooting, Bowers had used Gab to express anti-Semitic beliefs, hostility toward immigrants, opposition to HIS, and extremist views. The evidence presented at trial indicated that these beliefs were connected to his motivation. After his arrest, he had also made the statement, "I just want to kill Jews." These words had been relevant during the guilt phase because they helped establish motive. During sentencing, the broader meaning of the crime remained connected to the same evidence. The jury was not being asked to punish Bowers simply for holding offensive beliefs. The punishment was for the crimes he had committed. But the prosecution's evidence concerning his beliefs helped explain the nature of those crimes and why the victims had been targeted. That distinction was important. The law did not impose punishment merely because someone held an ideology. It imposed punishment because the ideology, according to the government's evidence and the jury's verdict, was connected to deliberate acts of murder and other federal offenses. On July 13, 2023, the jury determined that Bowers was eligible for the death penalty. This was another significant legal threshold. Eligibility did not yet mean that the death sentence had been imposed. The jury still had to consider aggravating and mitigating evidence before reaching its final decision. From July 17th through July 31st, the sentencing proceedings continued. The jury heard evidence relevant to the final determination. The supplied information does not provide the details necessary to reconstruct every argument, every piece of testimony, or every personal statement presented during this period. For that reason, a responsible account cannot invent courtroom exchanges or describe specific emotional reactions that are not documented in the provided material. What can be established is that the jury considered both aggravating and mitigating circumstances before deciding the punishment. This stage of the case illustrates an important principle of capital sentencing. Even after a defendant has been convicted of extremely serious crimes, the legal process requires the jury to make a separate determination concerning punishment. The existence of multiple deaths and the severity of the crime do not automatically produce a death sentence. The jury must consider the circumstances established during the proceedings and determine whether the statutory requirements for capital punishment have been met. In Bowers's case, the jury ultimately reached a unanimous conclusion. On August 2nd, 2023, the jurors unanimously recommended that Bowers receive the death penalty. The recommendation represented the culmination of a case that had begun nearly 5 years earlier, with the shooting at the Tree of Life complex. The following day, August 3rd, 2023, the court formally sentenced Bowers to death on 22 counts. The legal outcome could now be stated in precise terms: 63 convictions and a death sentence on 22 counts. The punishment was the most severe available under federal law. But even at this point, it is important to distinguish the legal outcome from the emotional meaning of the case. A sentence can establish accountability. It can declare that the defendant has been found responsible and that the crimes warrant the ultimate punishment. But it cannot restore the lives that were lost. It cannot return Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, or Irving Younger to their families and community. It cannot erase the injuries suffered by Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner. It cannot undo the injuries sustained by police officers who responded to the attack. The courtroom could determine what the law would do with Robert Bowers. It could not reverse what had already happened to everyone else. That distinction is particularly important when discussing the death penalty in a true crime narrative. The sentence can become the most dramatic point in a legal story, but it should not overshadow the crime's human consequences. The death sentence is the conclusion of a legal process, not the conclusion of the victim's stories. Their names existed before October 27, 2018, and their lives were more than the circumstances of their deaths. The legal record necessarily focuses on the crime. A victim-centered account must remember that the people themselves existed beyond the charges brought against their killer. The final punishment also did not change the essential character of the case. This was an attack on people gathered for Jewish religious activities. The federal prosecution established that Bowers was guilty of offenses involving murder, religious exercise, hate crimes, firearms, survivors, and law enforcement officers. The jury's unanimous recommendation and the court's subsequent sentence confirmed the seriousness with which the federal justice system treated those crimes. Yet the passage from shooting to sentence also reveals how different the timelines of violence and justice can be. The attack took less than 13 minutes. The investigation followed. The indictment came days later and was expanded months afterward. The trial did not begin until April 2023. The guilty verdict came in June. The sentencing process continued through July. The death sentence was formally imposed on August 3rd. Nearly 5 years had passed between the morning of the shooting and the final sentencing decision. For the victims' families and the wider community, those years could not simply be measured as the distance between two dates. They represented a long period during which the criminal case moved through investigation, prosecution, trial, conviction, and sentencing. The legal system proceeded according to its own timetable because the stakes demanded a careful process. Evidence had to be examined. Charges had to be proven. The jury had to make separate decisions about guilt and punishment. And at the end, the law produced its judgment. Robert Bowers was convicted on all 63 counts and sentenced to death on 22. That is the formal conclusion of the courtroom story. But it is not the conclusion of the consequences. The sentence belongs to the legal record. The loss belongs to the people who survived the victims, to the survivors who endured the attack, to the officers who responded, and to the Jewish communities whose place of worship became the scene of a mass killing. The death penalty could close one chapter of the prosecution. It could not close the lives that had been interrupted on October 27, 2018. And so, after all the charges, evidence, arguments, verdicts, and sentencing decisions, the story must eventually return to the 11 people whose names were at the center of it from the beginning. The courtroom had answered the question of punishment. What remained was the question of memory. What should be remembered when the name of a perpetrator has become internationally known, but the names of his victims risk being reduced to a list? The answer is simple, even if the loss is not. Remember the people first. Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, Irving Younger. Their deaths explain why the case existed. The conviction explains who was held responsible. The sentence explains what punishment followed, but neither can explain everything that was lost. For that, the story has to leave the courtroom and return to the community. The courtroom eventually reached its conclusion, but the story of the Tree of Life synagogue shooting could never truly end with a verdict or a sentence. On August 3, 2023, Robert Bowers was formally sentenced to death on 22 counts after a federal jury had convicted him on all 63 counts. Legally, the case had reached its most consequential conclusion. The man responsible had been identified, prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced. Yet the judgment could not change the events of October 27, 2018. 11 people had been killed inside a Jewish religious complex in Pittsburgh. 2 others, Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner, had survived serious wounds. Police officers had been injured while responding to the attack. And an entire religious community had been forced to confront violence directed at its members. Because of their identity, when the legal record is reduced to its most basic numbers, the case can sound almost abstract. 11 deaths, 2 seriously wounded survivors, 63 convictions, 22 death sentences. But behind every number was a human being. Joyce Feinberg was 75 years old. Richard Gottfried was 65. Rose Mallinger was 97. Jerry Rabinowitz was 66. Cecil Rosenthal was 59. David Rosenthal was 54. Bernice Simon was 84. Sylvan Simon was 86. Daniel Stein was 71. Melvin Wax was 87. Irving Younger was 69. These 11 names are more important than the name of the man who killed them. That may seem obvious, but true crime storytelling can easily reverse that order. The perpetrator's actions are dramatic. His ideology can be examined. His weapons can be documented. His arrest can be reconstructed. His trial can be followed. His sentence can become the final headline. And slowly, without intending to, the story can begin to revolve around him. But the Tree of Life shooting was not important because Robert Bowers became notorious. It was important because 11 people lost their lives while participating in their religious community. The victims were not there to become symbols. They were simply members of 3 Jewish congregations, Tree of Life, Dor Hadash, and New Light, gathered on a Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath. That setting became central to the federal case because prosecutors argued that Bowers had deliberately interfered with the victims' freedom to practice their religion because they were Jewish. The evidence presented at trial included his anti-Semitic online activity, his hostility toward Jews and immigrants, his opposition to HIS, evidence indicating that the attack had been planned, and the statement he made after his arrest. "I just want to kill Jews." Those facts helped establish the motive that prosecutors presented and the jury ultimately accepted through the guilty verdicts. But remembering the case only as an example of anti-Semitic extremism can also risk losing sight of the individuals who were killed. The ideology explains why the attack was prosecuted as a hate crime. It does not define the victims. They should not be remembered only as people who died because someone hated Jews. They were people who belonged to a community and gathered for religious practice. Their lives existed before the shooting, even though the supplied information does not provide the detailed biographies necessary to reconstruct those lives. That limitation should be respected. It is tempting to invent personal details to make a conclusion feel more emotional. But doing so would undermine the accuracy that a case like this requires. What can be remembered with certainty are their names, their ages, the place where they were gathered, and the fact that their lives ended in a deliberate act of violence. The two survivors, Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner, represent another dimension of the aftermath. They were seriously wounded but survived. Their presence reminds us that survival does not make someone untouched by violence. At the same time, the supplied information does not give enough detail to describe their later lives or to speculate about their emotional recovery. Their story, therefore, should be stated carefully. They survived serious injuries inflicted during the attack. That fact alone is significant. The same principle applies to the police officers who responded. When law enforcement arrived, the attack was still active. Bowers fired toward officers, and SWAT personnel entered the building to confront him. Officers were injured during the response. The supplied federal materials differ over the exact number described, with one account identifying 5 officers as injured during the response and arrest, and another judicial document specifically describing 4 officers being shot. The discrepancy should not distract from the central fact. Responding officers were placed in danger and suffered injuries while attempting to stop the attacker. Their actions were part of the immediate response that brought the shooting to an end and allowed Bowers to be taken into custody. The aftermath, therefore, belonged to several groups at once. There were families who lost relatives. There were survivors who had been seriously wounded. There were officers injured while responding. There were members of 3 Jewish congregations who had seen their religious community become the target of mass violence. And there was a criminal justice system that would spend years converting the events of one Saturday morning into a federal case. The legal process mattered because accountability mattered. On October 31, 2018, a federal grand jury indicted Bowers on 44 counts. On January 29, 2019, a superseding indictment expanded the case to 63 counts. In April 2023, the trial began. On June 16, 2023, the jury found him guilty on all 63 counts. 22 were eligible for the death penalty. On July 13, the jury determined that Bowers was eligible for capital punishment. After further sentencing proceedings, the jury unanimously recommended death on August 2nd. On August 3rd, the court formally sentenced him to death on 22 counts. The sequence demonstrates how far the case traveled from the original crime scene. The shooting itself was measured in minutes. The prosecution was measured in years. But even the final sentence could not provide a perfect ending. Criminal justice can establish responsibility. It can impose punishment. It can preserve evidence and create an official account of what happened. What it cannot do is reverse death. It cannot restore Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, or Irving Younger. It cannot erase the injuries suffered by Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner. It cannot make the responding officers forget the danger they faced. And it cannot return the Tree of Life community to the moment before the attack, when October 27, 2018 was simply another Saturday on the Jewish calendar. That is perhaps the most difficult truth in the aftermath of any mass killing. The justice system works forward. Memory often works backward. The court looks at evidence, charges, verdicts, and sentences. Memory returns to the people who were present before everything changed. In this case, the contrast is particularly stark. The evidence tells us that Bowers had expressed hatred online before the shooting. The evidence tells us that he had focused hostility on Jews, immigrants, and HIS. The evidence indicates that the attack was planned. The evidence establishes that he entered a Jewish religious complex with firearms and opened fire. The evidence establishes 11 deaths and serious injuries. The verdict establishes criminal responsibility. The sentence establishes punishment. But none of those facts should obscure the simplest human reality. Hatred became violence, and people died. The case is therefore a reminder of the importance of separating explanation from justification. Understanding Bowers' ideology helps explain the motive alleged and proven in court. It does not excuse the murders. Examining his online activity helps investigators understand the path to the attack. It does not make the ideology more interesting than the people who suffered because of it. Studying the legal process demonstrates how the government established its case. It does not diminish the grief behind the charges. And documenting the death sentence provides the final legal outcome without pretending that punishment can equal restoration. The Tree of Life shooting remains a case in which the distinction between a perpetrator-centered narrative and a victim-centered narrative matters enormously. Robert Bowers is part of the story because he committed the crime, but he should not own the story. The people he killed should. Their names should remain visible in the historical record, not merely as evidence used to convict their murderer, but as the people whose absence defines what was lost that morning. 11 names, 11 lives, a community gathering that became a crime scene, 2 seriously wounded survivors, injured officers, a long federal investigation, 63 convictions, 22 death sentences. Those facts form the structure of the case. But the meaning lies in what those facts represent. On October 27, 2018, people entered the Tree of Life synagogue complex to participate in Jewish religious life. Before the morning was over, 11 of them were dead. Nearly 5 years later, the man responsible stood before a federal court and received the most severe punishment available under federal law. Between those two moments was an investigation, a prosecution, a trial, and a verdict. Beyond them was something the courtroom could not measure: the continuing absence of the people who never came home. Perhaps that is where this story should end. Not with the weapons, not with the hateful posts, not with the arrest, not even with the death sentence. It should end with the names: Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, Irving Younger. Their killer became a name known around the world because of what he did. But the reason to remember the Tree of Life shooting is not to remember him. It is to remember the people whose lives were taken, the survivors who remained, the officers who responded, and the community that endured an attack on a place of worship. The final judgment of the court established what the law could establish. Robert Bowers was guilty on all 63 counts and was sentenced to death on 22. The rest belongs to memory. And memory, unlike a sentence, does not end when the courtroom doors close. The Tree of Life shooting did not end when Robert Bowers was taken into custody, and it did not end when the jury returned its verdict nearly 5 years later. The gunfire lasted less than 13 minutes, but the consequences extended far beyond that morning in Pittsburgh. 11 people were dead. Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner had survived serious injuries. Law enforcement officers had also been injured while responding. 3 Jewish congregations had been affected by an attack carried out during religious activity. And behind the federal prosecution was a larger question that could not be answered simply by a conviction. What happens to a community when hatred directed at its identity becomes physical violence inside a place of worship? The legal record provides a clear answer about responsibility. On June 16, 2023, a federal jury found Robert Bowers guilty on all 63 counts. On August 2, the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty, and on August 3rd, the court formally sentenced him to death on 22 counts. Those decisions established accountability within the criminal justice system. But accountability and recovery are not the same thing. A sentence can determine what happens to the person responsible. It cannot restore the people who were killed. That distinction is essential when looking at the aftermath of Tree of Life. The victims were not simply numbers in a federal indictment. They were 11 members of a Jewish community who had gathered on a Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, to participate in religious activities. Their names were Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, and Irving Younger. Their ages range from 54 to 97, with Rose Mallinger, at 97, the oldest. The age range is one of the most striking facts documented in the case because it demonstrates the breadth of the loss. The shooting did not simply remove one generation from a community. It took 11 individual lives, including people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Yet the supplied information does not provide detailed biographies of these victims, and it would be inappropriate to invent personal histories simply to make their stories more dramatic. What can be stated with certainty is enough. They had gathered as members of Jewish congregations, and they were killed because an armed attacker entered that religious setting and opened fire. Two others, Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner, survived serious injuries. Their survival is an equally important part of the record. A mass shooting is often described through the number of fatalities because death is irreversible and easily counted. But the two survivors remind us that the consequences of violence also include the people who remain alive after being directly attacked. The supplied case information does not provide enough verified detail to describe their later physical or emotional experiences. So those details should remain outside the story. What can be acknowledged is that both were direct victims of the attack, and both survived serious wounds. Their presence in the legal record ensured that the prosecution was not limited to charges concerning those who died. The responding officers form another part of the aftermath. When police arrived, Bowers was still inside, and the danger had not ended. He fired toward officers approaching the scene, and SWAT personnel entered the building to confront him and protect those who remained. Officers were injured during the response and arrest. The supplied federal materials differ concerning the precise number. One account identifies 5 officers injured during the response and arrest, while another judicial document specifically describes 4 officers being shot. The responsible conclusion is therefore not to erase the discrepancy, but to preserve it. Multiple law enforcement officers were injured while responding to and stopping the attack. Their injuries demonstrate that the danger extended beyond the synagogue's occupants. The attack became a confrontation involving not only worshippers and the gunman, but also officers, who entered an active and dangerous scene. Another lasting consequence of the case was the exposure of the ideological motivation behind the attack. Bowers had used Gab before the shooting to express anti-Semitic views, hostility toward immigrants, opposition to HIS, and extremist ideas associated with white supremacy. According to the supplied information, his online activity included statements portraying people connected with immigration as invaders. Only days before the shooting, he posted an extreme anti-Semitic message. After his arrest, he made the statement, "I just want to kill Jews." These facts became important because they demonstrated that the attack was not treated simply as an act of violence without an identifiable target or motive. The prosecution argued, and the jury ultimately accepted through the convictions, that Bowers had deliberately attacked people because they were Jewish. That conclusion placed the shooting within the framework of federal hate crime law and religious freedom protections. The case therefore became more than a prosecution for murder. It was also a prosecution concerning the use of violence to interfere with the religious practice of a protected community. This distinction matters because hate crimes have a particular social dimension. The immediate victims are the people directly attacked, but the intended meaning of such violence can reach beyond them. In the Tree of Life case, the attack occurred in a Jewish religious setting and was accompanied by evidence of explicit anti-Semitic hostility. The federal government therefore prosecuted the case under laws addressing religious exercise and hate crime. The 63-count indictment reflected that broader legal structure. 11 counts concerned interference with religious exercise resulting in death. 11 concerned hate crimes resulting in death. Other counts concerned the 2 surviving victims, law enforcement officers, and firearms. The indictment transformed the events of one morning into a complex federal case requiring the government to prove numerous separate legal elements. The subsequent trial demonstrated another consequence of the attack: the length of time required for justice in a capital case. The shooting occurred in October 2018. The trial did not begin until April 2023. During those intervening years, the case moved through investigation, federal indictment, a superseding indictment, and preparation for trial. On January 29, 2019, the superseding indictment expanded the charges from 44 to 63. The eventual trial lasted approximately 2 months. On June 16, 2023, the jury found Bowers guilty on every count. The sentencing phase then continued through July. On July 13, the jury found him eligible for the death penalty. From July 17 through July 31, jurors heard aggravating and mitigating evidence. On August 2, they unanimously recommended death. On August 3, the court imposed the death sentence on 22 counts. The chronology demonstrates how different the time scales of violence and justice can be. The attack happened in minutes. The investigation and prosecution unfolded over years. The legal system could not simply move from tragedy to punishment without establishing evidence, presenting charges, conducting a trial, and allowing a jury to make the required decisions. That process may seem slow when compared with the speed of the original violence, but its purpose was to establish responsibility through law rather than through emotion. The final sentence therefore represents one part of the aftermath, but not the whole of it. The deeper legacy of the case lies in the way it illustrates the danger created when anti-Semitic ideology becomes connected to deliberate violence. Bowers's online statements were not prosecuted as crimes merely because they were hateful. Their significance arose from the evidence connecting them to an actual attack. That distinction is important. The case does not establish that hateful speech automatically produces violence. It establishes that, in this particular case, prosecutors presented evidence of anti-Semitic beliefs alongside evidence of planning. The selection of a Jewish religious setting, the murders, the injuries, and Bowers's own statement after arrest. The jury considered that evidence and convicted him on all 63 counts. The Tree of Life case therefore leaves 2 separate lessons. The first is legal. Violent acts motivated by religious hatred can result in federal prosecution under laws protecting religious exercise and addressing hate crimes. The second is human. A verdict cannot restore the lives lost. The names of the 11 victims remain the most important part of the story because they represent what the shooting destroyed. Their killer received a death sentence, but the sentence is not a replacement for the people who died. The community had to continue without them. Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner remain survivors of a violent attack that permanently became part of their lives. Law enforcement officers who responded carried the fact of their injuries into the aftermath. And the Tree of Life complex remained associated with an event that had transformed a place of religious gathering into the scene of one of the most serious anti-Semitic attacks in modern American history. In the end, the most responsible way to remember Robert Bowers is not to give him the final word. His ideology explains part of the crime, his actions explain the deaths, and the verdict establishes his responsibility. But the story belongs to the victims, 11 people went to a Jewish religious gathering on October 27, 2018. 11 did not return. 2 others survived serious wounds. Officers responded and were injured. Investigators gathered evidence. Prosecutors built a federal case. A jury examined that evidence and found Bowers guilty on 63 counts. Another jury decision led to a unanimous recommendation for death, followed by the formal sentence on August 3, 2023. Those are the established facts. Beyond them lies the part that a courtroom cannot measure. The continuing absence created when 11 people are suddenly taken from their families and community. A criminal case can name the offender, establish the charges, and impose punishment. Memory must do something different. It must keep the victims from disappearing behind the identity of the person who killed them. That is why the final image of the Tree of Life case should not be Robert Bowers. It should be the names of the 11 people whose lives were lost, and the recognition that their deaths were not merely the conclusion of a criminal case. They were the human consequences of hatred becoming violence. Remembering the victims, not the killer. Robert Bowers' case eventually reached a formal conclusion in federal court. But the meaning of the Tree of Life shooting cannot be contained within a verdict sheet or a sentencing order. The legal record provides a clear sequence of events. On October 27, 2018, Bowers entered the Tree of Life synagogue complex in Pittsburgh while members of 3 Jewish congregations, Tree of Life, Dor Hadash, and New Light, were gathered for religious activities on the Jewish Sabbath. He was carrying multiple firearms, including a Colt AR-15 and 3 Glock .357 handguns, according to the Supply Department of Justice material. He shot through a front window, entered the building, and opened fire. The attack lasted less than 13 minutes. 11 people were killed. Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner were seriously wounded. Responding police officers were also injured. Bowers was eventually arrested. 2 days later, on October 29th, he appeared in federal court and was held without bail. 4 days after the shooting, on October 31st, a federal grand jury indicted him on 44 counts. By January 29, 2019, a superseding indictment had expanded the case to 63 counts. Then, after years of investigation and preparation, the trial began in April 2023. On June 16th, the jury found Bowers guilty on all 63 counts. 22 counts were eligible for the death penalty. On July 13th, the jury determined that he was eligible for capital punishment. From July 17th through July 31st, the sentencing proceedings continued as jurors considered aggravating and mitigating circumstances. On August 2nd, the jury unanimously recommended death. On August 3rd, the court formally sentenced Bowers to death on 22 counts. That sequence represents the legal conclusion of the case. But a final episode of a true crime story should not simply repeat the sentence and then stop. It should ask what remains after the legal process is spoken. In the Tree of Life case, what remains begins with the 11 people who were killed. Joyce Feinberg was 75. Richard Gottfried was 65. Rose Mallinger was 97. Jerry Rabinowitz was 66. Cecil Rosenthal was 59. David Rosenthal was 54. Bernice Simon was 84. Sylvan Simon was 86. Daniel Stein was 71. Melvin Wax was 87. Irving Younger was 69. Their ages are part of the official record, but they should not be mistaken for the entirety of who they were. The supplied information does not provide detailed biographies for each victim, and accuracy requires resisting the temptation to manufacture personal histories. What can be said with certainty is that they were members of Jewish congregations gathered for religious activity when they were attacked. They were not abstract figures in a political argument. They were human beings who had entered a place of worship on an ordinary Sabbath morning and did not leave alive. The fact that the oldest victim was 97 makes the scale of the tragedy especially stark. Rose Mallinger was not merely the oldest person killed. She was part of a group whose ages stretched across decades of community life. The youngest victim, David Rosenthal, was 54. The victims, therefore, represented a broad range of ages. But the available evidence does not justify assigning symbolic meanings to those ages. Their importance lies in the simple fact that each life was taken. The two survivors, Daniel Ledger and Andrea Wedner, occupy a different place in the record. They were directly attacked and seriously wounded, but they survived. Their experiences remind us that the consequences of a mass shooting are not limited to fatalities. Yet the supplied information does not provide enough detail about their later lives to describe their recovery, emotions, or private experiences responsibly. The correct approach is therefore to acknowledge what is established. They were seriously wounded victims who survived the attack. Their survival is an essential part of the story without requiring speculation about what came afterward. The same principle applies to the responding officers. Bowers fired toward police as they approached, and SWAT officers entered the building while the danger was still active. Officers were injured during the response and arrest. The supplied federal records differ over the exact number, with one account identifying 5 officers injured during the response and arrest, and another specifically describing 4 officers being shot. The discrepancy should remain visible rather than being artificially resolved. What matters is that law enforcement officers were injured while attempting to stop the attacker. Their response was part of the chain of events that ended the immediate violence and led to Bowers's arrest. The investigation that followed also left an important record concerning motive. Bowers had been active on Gab before the shooting. His posts contained anti-Semitic material, hostility toward immigrants, opposition to HIS, and extremist views. Evidence presented at trial connected his online activity to his anti-Semitic ideology. The prosecution also presented evidence indicating that the attack had been planned. And after his arrest, Bowers made the statement, "I just want to kill Jews." These facts became central to the federal case because the government alleged that Bowers had deliberately interfered with the victims' freedom to practice their religion because they were Jewish. The hate crime allegations were therefore not an afterthought. They were part of the central legal theory of the prosecution. The Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act formed part of the legal basis for the charges. The government's case argued that the attack was motivated by hatred of the victim's religion. The jury ultimately found Bowers guilty on all 63 counts, confirming the prosecution's allegations through the criminal trial process. That verdict matters because it distinguishes established facts from claims that were never tested. Bowers was not merely accused of the crimes. He was convicted of all 63 counts by a federal jury. The subsequent unanimous death recommendation and formal sentence on 22 counts represented the final punishment determined through the capital sentencing process. Yet even the strongest legal judgment has limits. It can identify responsibility. It can impose punishment. It can preserve a factual record. It cannot bring back the dead. It cannot erase the injuries suffered by survivors. It cannot undo the fear experienced by the people who were inside the building or the danger faced by the officers who responded. And it cannot return the Tree of Life community to the morning before the shooting. That is why the final reflection on this case should move away from the perpetrator. Bowers's name is necessary because the criminal justice system must identify the person responsible. His ideology is relevant because it explains the motive established in court. His online activity matters because it formed part of the evidence. His statements matter because they helped demonstrate intent. His conviction matters because it established criminal responsibility. His sentence matters because it records the punishment imposed by the court. But none of these facts should make him the center of the story. The center should remain with the people whose lives were taken. True crime can sometimes create an unintended distortion. The offender becomes memorable because his actions are extraordinary, while victims become names listed between charges and sentencing dates. The responsible answer is to reverse that emphasis. The crime was not extraordinary because the perpetrator was extraordinary. It was devastating because ordinary people were targeted in a place where they had gathered for their faith. The Tree of Life shooting also demonstrates the difference between understanding and excusing. Examining Bowers' anti-Semitism does not excuse his actions. Examining his online history does not transform hatred into justification. Understanding how investigators connected his statements to the crime does not make the ideology more important than the lives it helped target. Evidence can explain motive without diminishing responsibility. That distinction is essential when discussing extremist violence. The story should neither romanticize the offender nor turn his hatred into a spectacle. It should document it, establish what the evidence showed, and then return to the people affected by it. The legal process itself offers another lesson. The shooting took less than 13 minutes, but justice required nearly 5 years before the trial began. The government did not simply declare Bowers guilty. It investigated, indicted, expanded the charges, presented evidence, and allowed a jury to decide. The jury convicted him on every count. The sentencing process then required another determination before the death penalty was imposed. That slow progression is part of what separates criminal justice from revenge. The final outcome was severe, but it was reached through a formal process in which the evidence was tested and the defendant was given a trial. The case therefore ends with two realities existing side by side. The first is legal certainty. Robert Bowers was convicted on 63 federal counts and sentenced to death on 22 of them. The second is human permanence. 11 people were killed and cannot be restored. The first can be written into a judgment. The second remains with the families, survivors, community, and everyone who remembers the attack. On October 27, 2018, Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, and Irving Younger entered the historical record because their lives were taken. They deserve to remain there not simply as victims of Robert Bowers, but as the people at the heart of the story. Their names should be remembered before his. Their humanity should come before his ideology. Their lives should matter more than the details of the man who ended them. The final lesson of Tree of Life is therefore not about the power of a killer. It is about the cost of hatred. It is about what happens when anti-Semitic ideology moves from words and beliefs into deliberate violence. It is about the 11 lives lost, the survivors left behind, the officers injured while responding, and the community forced to carry the consequences. And it is about the responsibility of telling such a story carefully. Accuracy means distinguishing what was proven from what was merely alleged. Compassion means refusing to turn victims into background characters. Restraint means refusing to glorify the perpetrator. Memory means saying the names. Robert Bowers received the punishment determined by a federal court. But the final word does not belong to him. It belongs to the people who were there, the people who survived, the people who responded, and most of all, the 11 whose lives ended that morning. The courtroom could deliver a verdict. History can preserve the names, but remembering those names and remembering that they were people before they became victims is what keeps the story from becoming merely another case number in the archive of American violence.